Hi friends, this is children's literature about disability and why it's not all created equally. This is intended to be a quick guide to help you assess the books you want to include in your classroom library to ensure you have a variety of perspectives on disability. Ableism, sometimes called disableism, is discrimination against disabled people because of their disability. It may be overt, obvious discrimination, such as a hate crime, but this anti-disability sentiment is much more commonly expressed in smaller, subtle ways. This can teach us all to favor abled bodies and minds. Some examples are infantilization, where disabled people are assumed to be childlike, dismissing accessibility needs like captioning or a ramp, or taking autonomy away from disabled people by doing things like assuming they can't decide for themselves. This video will focus on the way that ableism can manifest in our classroom libraries. The first thing we need to discuss is why this matters. It's really easy to understand why books about disability are important, but it's harder to see why they need to live up to certain standards. This is important for disabled students because they're forming their view of themselves. They're trying out new ideas about their identities, and children are naturally going to emulate what they see. Providing them with language and models for understanding themselves can be incredibly beneficial. For your abled students, they deserve to understand as well. Because they aren't experiencing ableism, if they aren't taught explicitly about it, they're likely to perpetuate it. Before I really get into the several media tropes, I want to start with a disclaimer. Pointing out that a book utilizes an ableist trope doesn't mean that the book is bad or that the people who wrote it are bad. You may see books you love used as examples. Some of these books I love as well. Still, it's important to keep in mind that you have to have a multitude of perspectives on disability. Further, enjoying media while still viewing it critically is an important skill that both students and educators need to use. The first ableist trope that is common in children's books is the disability doesn't define me trope. This may be as simple as statements like different ability, or no, my ability is not my disability, or it may appear as the disabled person imagining themselves in an able body. This trope separates the person from their disabled identity, reinforcing the idea that disability is a negative thing, and that only when they overcome that disability they're valuable. Another harmful trope is the disability is inspiration trope. This trope tends to show the disabled person as an inspiration to those around them. Often, it either praises disabled people for completely common, everyday tasks, or only showcases incredibly successful disabled people. In the case of the praising everyday tasks, this trope centers the able perspective by infantilizing the disabled person. It makes the able person feel like they should work harder because the disabled person clearly works so hard to achieve their goals, therefore assuming that disabled people struggle so hard with everyday goals. In the case of showing successful disabled people, it reinforces the idea that the only worthwhile disabled person is one that is better and more successful than able people. Another thing to keep an eye on is the types of stories that are featured. While it's not a problem for your library to feature books that talk only about a disability, you should ensure that disability is featured in many different types of books. Disabled students want to read about kids like themselves doing fun things. Something else to look for in your library are books that feature a monster or a villain that's disabled. Is this character the only disabled character in the story? This can help to reinforce negative ideas about disability. Another important thing is the authors of the books. While anyone can write a book about a disabled person, no one will understand a disability like someone who lives with it. Ensure that your library features books that are own voices stories. My personal pet peeve trope is the mystery disability trope. This is when a book features a disabled character but refuses to tell the reader what this disability is. Frequently, I see this used to emphasize the idea that you should see the person and not the disability, which falls under the first trope that we discussed. Sometimes it's used as an excuse to write an inaccurate portrayal as well. Another problematic trope is the disabled sibling trope. This is an absolutely fine style of book, but it centers the view of disability around the abled person. If you only feature disability from this perspective, it never shows a disabled person telling their own story. A final component to keep an eye on is books where a disabled character experiences ableism. While this might be helpful in understanding ableism for students that don't experience it, it can do more harm than good. Your disabled students likely have direct experience with ableism. They might not want to encounter it in books. While you shouldn't necessarily avoid these books, you should provide warnings and reconsider the way they might be included in your lessons. Though these are all the tropes that I've included in this video, there are still many more. They may not be likely to be found in children's literature, but you may see them in other books, movies, or even in the news. Here are 2 sources that specifically focus on disability tropes and may help you to identify these tropes in your daily life.